Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Living Manna Church. I am Pastor Dave Sain, Senior Shepherd here at Living Manna. I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight as we open up Yah's Word and we get into some Bible study. So as we do every week, let's just open up with a word of prayer and then we'll kind of jump right into it. Father, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart that's willing to obey. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, well, again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. We are in the book of Romans. We've been in it for a while. Lots of great information that I want to share with you tonight. We are in chapter 11, and let me just pop this up on the screen. Here's our title for tonight. This is Romans number 19, 19 weeks of this, and we're in chapter 11. I think Romans goes up to about chapter 16, so just a few more chapters left, but it's going to take us a little while to get through all of it. We're in chapter 11 today, and I doubt that we're going to get all the way through chapter 11. In fact, I know we're not going to get all the way through chapter 11, but we're going to do our best to cover as much information as we can. This evening's verse, coming right out of Romans chapter 11 and verse 11, contains both the theme and the title for tonight. And verse 11 says the following. This, of course, is the Scripture's version. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Let it not be. But by their fall, deliverance has come to the nations to provoke them to jealousy. And of course, the title for tonight is To Provoke to Jealousy. Romans number 19, To Provoke to Jealousy. Okay, well, like I said, we've been doing this for a while. So, we've been building up a series of thoughts. We've been trying to understand what the whole book is about. It is a continuous revelation, a continuous developing of ideas. And so here we are. We're really, if you think about it, we are really at the meat of the book. This is some of the most important information that there is actually within the book. And so with that, let's do, I don't want to do review, so to speak, too much of it anyway. But I do want to give some sort of summary thoughts as we jump into chapter 11, because it's a really, really important chapter, but it doesn't stand alone. It is connected to all the chapters that came before it. So without doing a whole review of all the other chapters, here's some thoughts that I want you to consider before we begin to read chapter 11. Saul, Paul, has been building a case. He's been building a case all the way from chapter 1. He has been building a case line upon line, chapter after chapter, concept after concept. He's been putting bits and pieces of information together and building this theme that goes throughout the book. And one very major part of the theme that I want to make sure everybody gets is that this whole thing, everything that Yah has done, has always been by grace. It has always been that Yah will have compassion on whom he will have compassion, and he will harden whom he will harden. And that's something that was really developed in chapter 9. But it has always been by grace by faith through grace. And of course, the example in chapter 9 is that of Israel in Egypt receiving God's grace or God's favor, while Egypt receiving God's wrath. One destined to favor or compassion, one destined to wrath. And God uses both of them to bring about his purposes. Very, very important point to hold on to, because Shaul develops that principle of what happened in Egypt to what's happening in the first century and what has happened in the centuries after that, all the way up to our very own century. So number two, Israel has chosen or was chosen by grace, again, by favor, by Yah having compassion on them, to be witnesses to the world. This is established in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. It was Israel's job to be a witness for Yehovah to the world. Number 3, because of Israel's rebellion, because of Israel's religion, or the influence of so many other things, what religion had become to them, that wrath is now upon what remains of the house of Israel. Of course, we're talking about the house of Judah at the time of Yeshua, but that is the Israel of its day. And now, because of their rebellion, wrath, Shaul has told us as the chapters have gone on, is now about to fall on them. And from his perspective, it still is future, because he has written this book prior to 70 AD, prior to the destruction of the temple, but he knows it's coming. He knows wrath is coming. This is something he clearly understood. So now the situation, and this is why it's so important to understand how he develops this chapter by chapter. Now what he's telling us, using that example of Egypt and Israel, now he's telling us that grace or compassion or favor is now being extended to the nations, while Israel, the nation, the leadership, they are now the objects of wrath. They are the ones destined to wrath, and now the nations will be destined to favor, destined to compassion. And so I want you to realize the flip that went on there. First it was Israel and Egypt, and he's using that example now to show us the situation of what is going on in his day and what will unfold by 70 AD all the way to 135 AD. Destruction of the temple, and of course the scattering, the scattering of Judah all across the world. And yet, despite the fact that that is coming, that this is what is about to come, he is going to tell us, or is really in the process of telling us, that there has always been and always will be a remnant, a small group, not the whole group. The whole group now we're going to find out is destined to wrath. But there is a small group called Israel of the 12 tribes that will be a witness both in Shaul's day and will be a witness beyond Paul's day, all the way up to our day. And of course, we are talking about the Netzarim. So just a couple of thoughts I want you to be aware of. And now, because of the tone of chapter 9 and chapter 10, which definitely flips the script on the house of Israel, if we want to think about this in the most simplistic terms, Israel's now the enemy, right? Israel's now in the position of Egypt, of Pharaoh. Wrath is coming to them, but favor is now coming to other people, but using the remnant. Now, unfortunately, and listen, you can read this, it's sort of surface information, and a lot of people got this concept because it's right on the surface. It's easy to understand, except what the nations have done, or what has happened over time from the second to third to fourth, all the way to now, centuries, is that eventually, even though the remnant were supposed to be witnesses, even though it was the house of Israel, Judah, remember, the apostles that are sent out, they are all Jewish. All the writers of the New Testament, they are all Jewish. All the disciples, not just the apostles, all the disciples, they are Jewish. What happened at Shavuot happened at Jerusalem to Jews. And what winds up happening is really, I think, because of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation, if you would, of the book of Romans, the nations eventually, and I'm talking about second to third, really the end of the second, beginning of the third century, they abandoned, really, I guess abandoned is not the right word, they rejected the testimony of Israel, the testimony of the Jews, the Netzarim. They were rejected by the influx, by the growing number of Gentiles who were coming into faith, who were coming into this thing, coming into this belief, but wanted to be disassociated with the people called Jews, i.e., the Netzarim. It was just too Jewish for them, and they thought this was supposed to be something new, or that what they were teaching, what the Netzarim were doing, was not new and not quote unquote Christian enough. And we went over some of this stuff last week. We talked about Jerome and some of the other leaders and teachers and some of the other stuff that goes on. So this is what's going on in the second to third century. The Gentiles who are coming in begin to abandon or reject the testimony of the Netzarim. A hatred for Israel, a hatred for the Jews, produces new doctrines. Since they did not want to be associated with what the Jews had taught, and again, don't forget, their teaching, Yeshua taught all the feast days. Yeshua said to listen to the words of Moses. Don't follow what the Pharisees do, but listen to Moses. Shaul also many, many times tells us to obey God's law. Very, very different from not being saved by the law. Totally different conversation. We had that already. But he does tell us over and over and over again to obey God's instruction. But what winds up happening is that because of the Gentile influx and their hatred, their prejudice, the animosity between Jew and Gentile, a new group was eventually formed called the church, the Gentile church. And that's a name that has stuck with us for the last 1800 years, the word church. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But what made this new Gentile establishment devoid of anything Jewish also became devoid of anything Mosaic, anything from Moses' instructions. The idea is that something new had happened, and they were about the new, and what the Jews were doing was old. Therefore, what the Netzarim were doing was old, and we don't want to do that. This, of course, led to persecution. Persecution of who? Well, the Jews. Rome hated them, Greeks hated them, the whole world hated them, and they hated the Netzarim as well. And that leads to about 1,000 years, maybe even longer than that, but about 1,000 years of persecution. From the time of the Greeks to the time of the Romans, to the time of the Middle Ages, all the way through the church, all the way through the growth of Christianity, the Netzarim, the Jews, were under persecution wherever they went. This created, this has its eventual manifestation, if you will, in what becomes known as dispensationalism. And without getting into a whole dissertation of what dispensationalism is, what its end product does is that it teaches or presents the idea that God is done with Israel, finished with them. They messed up. They killed Messiah. They messed up. Yah has washed his hands of them. And in place of them, you got to get this. This is really, really important, because this is really the basis of all of modern Christendom throughout the ages, including up till today, that God has chosen over the house of Israel. He has chosen the Gentile church. And now that's a little bit modified in our present age, because I'd say in about the last 70 years or so, or maybe even 50 years or so, there is this new evangelical concept that, well, maybe God's not totally done with the Jews. Maybe he's not totally done with them. Once he's finished with us and once we are removed, then God's attention will again be returned to the Jews, to the house of Judah. Now, again, I'm not telling you that this is, I'm not saying that in any way am I putting forward this as an idea of a teaching. I'm just telling you how history wound up unfolding and where we are today. But I want you to realize that the core, the center of anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years, not just in the days of Shaul, the days of Yeshua and Rome, for the last 2,000 years, the core of anti-Semitism has been the church. It has been Christendom in Europe, in the Middle East, all over the world. The core of anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jew, and of course, connected to it, those people who are associated with them, the Netzarim, no matter what names they wound up being called later on in history, There was an animosity to them, and the Gentile church considered them also, even though they were made up of Jews and Gentiles, considered all of them Jews. This is really, really important, especially for what we're going to talk about tonight. This really does sort of set the stage, if you would, of what's coming, or what he's about to talk about here in chapter 11. So let's get the picture here. Here's chapter 10 and verse 21. And again, if you just read chapter 10, if you just read portions of Romans, I can almost get how some people might have made the mistake of thinking God is he's done with the house of Israel. No more, wants nothing to do with them. I can almost get how people might think that if you don't read the whole book, if you don't understand the whole story. Because here's how chapter 10 ends. Verse 21, here's Shaul. He says, but to Israel, and he's quoting the scripture about what Yah said to Israel, that they missed it. That they missed their chance, that they are now going to have wrath upon them. He says, but to Israel, he says, that is Yah says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. And that's kind of been the perception of the Gentile believers for, like I said, about the last 1800 years. God is done with the house of Israel. They're finished. His attention is now on, quote unquote, the church. Now, it's kind of a somber ending. Chapter 10 is a somber ending because it really does kind of end on, wow, God is really ticked off at Israel. He really has had it up to here with them, and things are about to change. No doubt with any of that. And history plays that out. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. The people are scattered. The people are tortured or persecuted. Horrific things happen. So in one sense, I get how if you just sort of look at the circumstantial evidence without really reading the scripture, but if you look at the circumstantial evidence, I can get how some people, maybe over history, would say, yeah, well, he's done with them. But this is a lot more than just circumstantial evidence. This was the hatred in the heart of men. Now, don't forget, this story runs parallel. We've been talking about the wedding feast for a couple of weeks now in the studies, because it is a parallel story to everything that Shaul is telling us in Romans. And that same sort of God is done with them is apparent even in the parable of the wedding feast. Here's Matthew chapter 22 and verse 7. It says, and of course, you know the parable. He had the king has a wedding plan for his son. He invites his guests. They don't come. So finally, he gets a verse 7. It says, but when the sovereign heard that they weren't going to come, he was wroth. He had wrath. He was mad. And he sent out his soldiers. It's going to wind up to be Rome, because that's how the analogy is being played out. And said, destroy those murderers, those who killed his prophets, his servants, and set their city on fire. So as an analogy, he's talking about Judah. He's talking about Jerusalem. God did exactly that. He set the city on fire, and he killed those murderers, those who murdered the apostles, those who murdered the disciples, those who murdered the prophets, those who murdered Yeshua. Verse 8 then says, so that's, if you take it, if you end your reading right there, well, then you can say, well, look, even Yeshua said he's done with them. He's finished with them. That's it. Kaput. Burn their city. I'm done with those people. But verse 8 then says, then he said to his servants. To what servants? Well, if we're following the analogy of the story of the gospel, to his Jewish servants, or really to his Netzarim servants, to the branches, to the believers of his day. He's going to send them out as witnesses, and that's what the story or the parable tells us. Then he said to his servants, to the Netzarim, to the Jews, the wedding feast is indeed is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. So while on one hand, yes, judgment is coming to Judah, to the house of Israel, and to Jerusalem, and to the temple, no doubt. But does that mean that God is done with them? Well, he's sending out his servants, and his servants are of them. They are them. They are the remnant of those people. Romans chapter 11 and verse 1 gives us sort of the next page of the story, so you don't get stuck on the idea that destroy those murderers and set their city on fire. Those who were invited were not worthy. Forget them. Get rid of them. Listen to chapter now 11 and verse 1 with all of the background we just went over. Here is Shaul continuing right after he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people, to the house of Israel. Romans 11 and verse 1, I say then, has Elohim rejected his people? Now, if we're going to answer this as religion has answered it over the last almost 1,800 years, the answer would be yes. Yeah, he got rid of them. He's not dealing with it anymore. They're finished. They're kaput. They got a brand new people. And now, of course, it's kind of evolved into, yeah, well, maybe he'll deal with them afterward once he's finished with us. But listen to what he says here. I say then, has Elohim rejected his people Israel? Let it not be. And of course, I put it there in yellow. Remember, yellow is me. Red is just me trying to emphasize what the scripture says. No, absolutely not. Let that sink in for a second, because it changes everything. In doing this, in the destruction of Jerusalem, in the destruction of the temple, in the diaspora, does that mean that God has rejected his people Israel? From a church perspective, yes, he did. But Shaul it's almost as if Shaul knew, maybe he didn't know, maybe Yah knew and was just moving him to write this, but he knew what was coming. He knew that would be the understanding, that would be the position that people would take. And yet he tells us emphatically, no. For I also am of Israel. So Shaul's giving his own testimony. He's saying, I'm of Israel, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So if Yah is just getting rid of his people, then why is he using Shaul? Why is Shaul the apostle? Why Peter? Why James? Why John? Why, all of them? And so he's saying, I'm of them. No, God has not forsaken his people. Despite what it looks like on the surface, Yah did not forsake his people. Number two, Elohim, and again, and I highlighted it in red so it really pops out for you, and I think I bolded it too. It says, Elohim has not rejected his people whom he knew beforehand. Let that sink in for a second, because it is very, very different from what we've been told, from what most theological perspectives are, from what most end times concepts and ideas, from dispensationalism itself. This is telling us something very, very, it's almost as if everybody stopped reading at Romans 10:21 or read only a little bit of the parable of Matthew 22 and didn't finish reading. And Shaul emphatically says, no, that is not so. Don't even begin to think like that. So there's a dilemma here. He is judging them. Wrath has come upon them. They are the object of wrath, just like Egypt was, to bring grace and favor to the nations. So how does this work? How is Yah not done with those people or his people? Remember, they are his people. We're talking about the house of Israel. Okay, this is really important. I didn't know if I was going to go through all of this, but and I'm only going to get a little bit into this tonight. The verses we're about to read are important because they fit in what we're talking about right now, but they are also relative to what we will talk about next week, which is really part of a major topic that's found here in chapter 11. So is God done with his people? Well, prophetically throughout the scripture, multiple times, God said, not ever. He won't be. And one of the most significant chapters, don't forget, Shaul knows all this stuff. Shaul read all this stuff. And the people that he's writing to in Rome, at the synagogue in Rome, they know all of this stuff. So if he's reached out to an obstinate people all the day long and wrath has come upon them, well, then what is their lot? What's the eventual end of them? Well, Jeremiah 31 is a phenomenal chapter. And we could just take a couple of verses out of Jeremiah, but I really want to read it in context, because I think what you're going to see is, as we read it in context, you're going to see the whole history as we go over it of how things have unfolded. This is all prophecy of what is actually coming true in Shaul's day and what has unfolded over the last 2,000 years. Now, this is a very famous chapter. Those of you that are, really avid Bible students, you recognize Jeremiah 31 as the chapter of the New Covenant, also quoted in the book of Hebrews. So we're going to get there, but rather than just read that, let's start at verse 1, because this is talking about the restoration of the house of Israel, of both the northern house and the southern house. Now, the northern house, of course, is scattered into the nations. Jeremiah and the southern kingdom are about to be taken by Nebuchadnezzar. So this is history to them. The northern house is gone. The southern house is about to be taken into captivity. But Jeremiah is talking about way beyond even the events of his day. Listen to Jeremiah chapter 31, and we're going to start right at verse 1, and we're going to go through. I'm going to skip a couple of verses just for time's sake, but I'm going to go over like 95% of it, because the story is amazing. Once you realize what the story is actually saying and how it fits into the book of Romans. So here it is, Jeremiah 31 and verse 1, not verse 11, that's just a typo. Verse 1, it says, "At that time declares Yehovah, I shall be the Elohim of all the clans, the tribes of Israel, and they shall be my people." Now, don't forget, when Jeremiah is writing this, that's not so. So this is something future he's talking about. "Thus said Yehovah, a people escaped from the sword, found favor in the wilderness. Israel, when it went to find rest, Yehovah appeared to me from afar, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I shall draw you with loving commitment." I didn't highlight those words, but maybe I should have, because this is Yah speaking to the whole house of Israel, those scattered in the northern kingdom and those of Judah about to be scattered. And he's telling them, I have loved you, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the descendants of the tribes. I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, he's going to draw them back with a loving commitment. And here it is, verse 4, really important. I am, and I put it in blue so that it kind of pops out even more so than just red. I am going to build you again, and you shall be rebuilt. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. He is referring to the house of Israel as crumbled, or about to be crumbled. And he's telling them there is going to come a day, because of my loving commitment to you, that I am going to build you back up. The you, we're going to find out in just a couple of seconds here, is the whole house of Israel, is both Judah and Ephraim. Though they are two separate nations, even by this time in history, he's talking about the both of them. And listen to what he says, verse 4, again, there in blue. I am going to build you again, and you shall be rebuilt, O maiden, or O virgin of Israel. Again, you shall take up your tambourines and go forth in the dances of those who rejoice. So instead of the scattering and the separation and the mourning and the judgment that you're in, this is what's coming. But I want you to, again, highlight in your mind, or if you've got the notes, if you've downloaded the notes, that he's going to build them again. So they have been broken down. This is reminiscent. I want you to realize this is exactly what Yeshua is referring to in Matthew chapter 16, just before the transfiguration on the Mount. This is Yeshua speaking and asking them, who do men say that I am? And you know the conversation. Of course, Peter calls out and says that he is Yeshua, the son of the living Elohim. And in response to that, listen to what Yeshua says. And I also say to you that you are Kepha, Peter, and on this rock, Yeshua, the testimony of who he is, I shall build my assembly, and the gates of the grave, Sheol, death itself, will not overcome it, meaning the assembly. Well, what is he referring to? Well, you know, this we read this, and of course, when you read this in a King James or NIV, it says, I will build my church. And of course, as history has gone on, we've taken that to mean, well, he's going to build his Catholic church, and he's going to build his Protestant church, and he's going to build his evangelical church, and his Pentecostal church, and his Baptist church, and his Lutheran church, and his Methodist church, or i.e., let's wrap it all together, he's going to build his Gentile church. That is not what he's talking about, guys. That is out of context. He's referring to Jeremiah. Jeremiah is now being told by Yah, I'm going to bring you back because of my commitment, my everlasting love for you. I am going to build you again. So here's Yeshua now telling us, I will build again the thing that had been broken down. What's broken down? The assembly, the congregation. And I put those words down there on the bottom of the notes there. It says assembly. Well, that's the word for assembly in the Hebrew is kahal. The word for it in the Greek is ekklesia. It can be translated as assembly. It can be translated as congregation, or more often than not, it is translated as church. Church means a congregation, but it's not talking about church the way we think about it today, the way most think about it today. He's talking about the building of his assembly, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So, i.e., what does assembly and congregation or kahal and ecclesia mean? Or when Yeshua says, I will build my assembly, he means I will rebuild or build back up because it has fallen down, the house of Israel. So now I want you to get a time reference as we're going through Jeremiah. Jeremiah is referring to the words Yeshua would say, or Yeshua is referring to the words that Jeremiah already said. And you're going to see that this flows through a timeline when we begin to really interpret and understand what Jeremiah is actually talking about. So important stuff. We can put Yeshua in these words. So this is Yeshua telling him, I'm going to build you back up. Here is the next verse, verse 6 in the book of Jeremiah. He says, for there shall be a day when the watchman. Now what's really neat is that word watchman is the word branches, netzarim. The watchman. Now, a job of a watchman is normally to watch for the city, to see if there's invaders, make sure nobody's coming, and when they see the enemy coming, to blow the shofar. But that's not all the watchman does. In this case, he's talking about the watchman, the netzarim, the branches. So again, we can put it in a historical timeline of what he's talking about. These watchmen, these branches, are also going to cry out for worship. Listen to what it says. For there shall be a day when the watchmen, the branches, the netzarim, cry on Mount Ephraim. Now, he's talking about the people of the northern house. Now, this word Ephraim is really, really important. And again, I'm only going to touch some of it today in Jeremiah, but it's going to be a major topic for the end of chapter 11 for next week. But we need this introduction before we can get there. So they're going to cry out on Mount Ephraim. So he's talking about the people of the northern house. Don't forget, Jeremiah is writing to the people of the southern kingdom, but he's referring to the people of the northern house. And it's the watchmen who are going to cry out from the northern house. So who's doing this crying out? The people of the northern house are doing this crying out. Arise and let us go up to Zion. to Yehovah our Elohim. For thus said Yehovah, sing with gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Cry out, give praise, and say, O Yehovah, save your people. Yeshua, your people. All right, so stick a little bit in there, but it gives it some context. I want you to realize what's literally being spoken about here is, don't forget, the northern kingdom split off. They did their own thing. They never went back to Jerusalem for worship. They set up their own kind of worship, their own temple. They set up their own altars, all sorts of idolatrous things, their own holidays, and eventually God scatters them. Well, this is telling us that one day Ephraim is going to say, is going to shout as a watchman, I want to go back to Zion. I want to go back to the place of worship. And because of it, cry and give praise, because salvation will come to his people. To who? To the remnant of Israel. You're going to see that word a lot, remnant. It's not everybody. This Jeremiah is telling us this is not everybody, but this is a remnant. Whether it's the watchman or the whole house of Israel, they are considered a remnant. Verse 8, he says, see, I am bringing them from the land of the north. Okay, they lived in the northern kingdom, the house of Israel, but this goes way beyond that. He says, I am bringing them from the land of the north, and shall gather them from the ends of the earth. Gather who? Ephraim. Gather him from every place that he's at. So, guys, this is prophecy of what's going to happen in ages to come, because Ephraim is going to be scattered all over the earth, and there's going to come a day when Ephraim, the Netzarim, will become the watchman who's actually crying out and saying, let's go back to Zion. Think about the magnificence of this, what's actually being said. Let's listen to the next thing. Let's read the verse 8 again in red. I am bringing them from the land of the north, and shall gather them from the ends of the earth. How? Well, through Yeshua. Don't forget, this is about save your people, Yeshua, your people Israel, or Hosea, your people Israel. Among them, look who he's bringing back from Ephraim. Among them, the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor. Just think about the gospel accounts. Who does Yeshua go to? Who does he minister to? The people who were not allowed in the temple. The blind, the lame, the sick, those with child. He says, those with child and those in labor together, and here it is, a great assembly, a great congregation, a great kahal, a great ecclesia, or a great church. But he's not speaking about church the way we define it today, or it's been defined for 1,800 years. This prophecy is saying the church is Ephraim coming back to Mount Zion. It says, returning here. Verse 9, with weeping they shall come, and with their prayers I bring them. I shall make them walk by rivers of water in a straight way, in which they do not stumble. For I shall be a father to Israel and Ephraim. This is about the both of them. This is Israel, meaning all 12 tribes, but Ephraim. Ephraim is also another name for the northern house. And again, this is going to be really, 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 really important that you get that God speaks of the northern house as Ephraim. For Ephraim, he says, he is my firstborn. Remember that. Kind of remember that verse if you can. Take it and store it in the back of your mind. Because, I mean, if you think about it, is Ephraim the firstborn? No, Ephraim's not the firstborn. And yet, this is going to be very relevant in the rest of chapter 11. Ephraim is the firstborn. But we'll get more into that in just probably not even this week, but next week. But let's continue on here in Jeremiah and get the content of these verses. So here's verse 10. Hear the word of Yehovah, O nations. So he's calling Ephraim from out of the nations, but now he's telling the nations I want you to listen. Again, remember, nations is Gentiles. Hear the word of Yehovah, O nations, and declare it in the isles, in the countries, in the lands afar off, and say. So this is what the nations are going to say. This is what they're going to see when this event happens that shows God's everlasting love. He who scattered Israel gathers him, and shall guard him as a shepherd his flock. For Yehovah shall ransom Jacob and redeem him from the hand of one stronger than he. This is talking about the gospel message. Who's the one stronger than he? What's the reason Ephraim's been scattered? Because of their rebellion, because of their sin. Well, he's telling us, I'm going to regather them. I'm going to redeem them from the one who is stronger than they. Who's that? Well, that's the serpent, or sin. And again, this brings us right back to the gospel story, John chapter 8, where Yeshua tells them that he is the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Set us free from what? We're slaves to no one. Yes, you are. You are a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son does. This is what Jeremiah is referring to. He's saying this is going to be remedied sometime in the future through Ephraim and Judah, and they will all be regathered, because he who scattered them will regather them. Verse 12, it says, and they shall come in, and all shall sing on the height of Zion. Remember, the thing that kind of connects them is Zion. Again, going to be important later. And stream to the goodness of Yehovah, for grain, and for new wine, and for oil, and for the young of the flock, and the herd. And their being shall be like well-watered garden, and never laying. He's talking about, the joy that they're going to have once they realize this, once they begin starting to come back and understand. Then shall a maiden rejoice in a dance, and young men and old together. And I shall turn their mourning, their time of scattering, to joy, and shall comfort them, and shall make them rejoice from their sorrow, and shall fill their being of the priest with fatness, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, declares Yehovah. I think he's kind of talking kingdom words. This is the end of this thing is just tremendous joy. Remember, Yeshua said, not even the gates of the grave are going to come against or hinder this, my congregation, my people. So these are the words. So it's all talking about, dancing and joy and all good stuff that's going to come out of this, even though there's been a time of mourning. Let's continue with the narrative. Verse 15 now says, thus says Yehovah, a voice was heard in Ramah. Now, Ramah is a city in a town in the area of Benjamin, the allotment that was given to Benjamin. It's a reference to a memorial to Benjamin's mother, to Rebekah. It's a memorial to her. And so when he says a voice was heard in Ramah, it's Benjamin's mom. Remember, she dies giving birth to him. Wailing, bitter, weeping. I said Rebekah. Rachel weeping for her children. Now, who is Rachel? Rachel is the mother of Benjamin and Joseph, but she is also the mother of Ephraim and Manasseh, because Ephraim and Manasseh come from Joseph. So indirectly here, and this is exactly the analogy that he's making, because Ephraim's the one coming back. So a voice is heard in Ramah in that memorial that was set up for the northern house over the death of her children, and now the northern house are going to be coming back. And look at what it says: refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more, not her child Benjamin, but for all of her children, the children that come. She is, for all intents and purposes, Rachel is the mother of the northern house. Because they are no more. Verse 16, and why are they no more? Because they've been scattered. Ephraim has been scattered into the nations. Verse 16, thus says Yehovah, Hold back your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares Yehovah. He's telling Rachel, stop crying, stop weeping. Something wonderful is going to happen to your children, Ephraim. Yes, Joseph and Benjamin, but Ephraim and Manasseh, the whole northern house of Israel. There is going to be a reward for your work, declares Yehovah, and they shall return from the land of the enemy. So Rachel's crying because she has no children, and Yah's telling her, yes, you do. Stop crying. Wait till you see how many children of the northern house of Ephraim are going to come back. Verse 17, and there is expectancy for your latter end. This is going to happen at the end, he's telling her. Declares Yehovah, and your children, the northern house, the sons of Joseph, shall return to their own country. Verse 18, I have clearly heard Ephraim. Again, so that you understand, he's talking about Ephraim as a child of Rachel. I have clearly heard Ephraim lamenting, you have chastened me, and I was chastised. Like an untrained calf. He's talking about all the weeping and mourning that Ephraim will do in their scattering. Ephraim says, turn me back, and I shall turn back. Repent, for you are Yehovah, my Elohim. For after my turning back, I repented. I turned back to Yah. So at some point, what's Ephraim going to do? He's going to turn back to Yah. I repented, and after I was instructed, I struck myself on the thigh. That is to say, once I figured this out, once I understood this, maybe we wouldn't say, in today's vernacular, you wouldn't say, I struck myself on the thigh. You'd say maybe I kicked myself in the butt. You know, I got so mad and upset with myself that I missed this, that, you know, you ever just sometimes just want to almost hit yourself and say, what are you doing? Why didn't you see this? Well, listen to what he's saying. After I was instructed, while I was scattered, I figured it out. I understood it, and I struck myself on the thigh. I was like, oh my goodness, yes. Notice it's after he's instructed. Again, what is instruction? You guys know. And so after he's instructed, after he realizes what the story's about and what's about to happen, he says, I was ashamed, even humiliated, for I bore the reproach of my youth. So this Ephraim out amongst the nations is going to wake up and figure out Yah's instruction, and in Yah's instruction is going to realize how humiliating, how wrong, how out of it, how far away they truly were. And you only get this when you realize, when you repent and realize instruction. This is, I hope, starting to sound very, very familiar to all of us. I hope to all of us, not to some of us, to all of us, because he's talking about you, your story. Verse 20, it says, is Ephraim a precious son to me, a child of delights? For though I spoke against him, and Yah did, I still remembered him. Remember the whole book of Hosea, they're out there, they're amongst the nations. That is why my affections were deeply moved for him. I have great compassion. Guys, we spent, I don't know how long talking about chapter 9 of Romans. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion, and I will harden whom I will harden. And you know what? He's God. He can do that. So here's what he's saying that he's going to do to Ephraim, though he scattered him, judged him. When he turns back, when he repents, when he gains instruction, when he realizes the humiliation, my affections are for him, I will have compassion. Compassion on whom Yah chooses, I will have compassion on him, declares Yehovah. This wonderful story, well, the story is getting better and better, but realize we're talking about us. We're talking about what's happening in Shaul's day and beyond, being prophesied here to us in the book of Jeremiah. But the account doesn't stop there. Let's go on. Here is verse 21. Set up signposts, make landmarks, set your heart towards the highway, the way. Now, you got to picture this in a real sort of practical sense. So Ephraim, who used to be in the northern kingdom, right? If they were going to go back to Zion from being scattered, let's just say, as a people of that century, if they were going to come back, he's saying, set up signposts, set up a way that leads them back to Zion. Let it be a highway, if you would. But actually what he says is, set my heart toward the highway, towards the way. How does Ephraim get back to Zion? How does Ephraim get instruction, or because of instruction, comes back to Zion? By the way. And of course, you know what Yeshua says, John chapter 14, I am the way. This is what it's referring to, the calling back of the other sheep. According to the way in which you went, turn back, O maiden or virgin of Israel. Turn back to these cities of yours, till when you would turn here and there, O backsliding daughter. For Yehovah has created what is new on the earth. A woman encompasses a man. Something new is coming. Something so new that Ephraim amongst the nations and Judah are going to come back to him. This new thing created on the earth is a woman encompassing a man, or a bride, her husband. And of course, we are talking about Yeshua Messiah. Now, I skipped a couple of verses. It talks about eating the grape and the bitterness of the individual, rather than a father eating grapes and the son not having bitter taste. We'll deal with that another day. It's only a couple of verses, but it doesn't break up the continuity of what's being said here. So we're going to skip down to verse 27, and I got this all in red because this is the verse of we think Jeremiah 31:31, which talks about the new covenant, is the verse. This is the verse. This is the jewel. This is the crown. Guys, if you get this, you're going to get what Shaul is telling us in Romans chapter 11, really from chapter 9 to chapter 11, but you're going to get chapter 11. Here it is. Look at verse 27. So with all that he just said, see, the days are coming, declares Yehovah, and all the stuff he just said, those are the days coming, that I shall sow, scatter, cast seed. But listen to what he's saying. That I shall sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man, the nations, or the Gentiles, and the seed of the beast, the nations. Hold on a second. Do you realize what that just said? This just explains to us everything that the revelation that Shaul has, both in Ephesians and Galatians and in Romans. He realized out of this verse, or I want you to realize out of this verse, what did Yah do to the northern kingdom? And not just the northern kingdom, to the southern kingdom too. He sowed their seed into, with the seed of other men, other tribes, other tongues. They were scattered into the nations. Guys, here's the verse I'm telling you, this is big. This is really, 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 really big to understanding the whole story. He sowed them into the seed of men and the seed of the beast, the nations. Ephraim would be scattered and become the nations. That's what this is telling us. His seed will mix with them. Even Judah's seed will mix with them. And it shall be that as I have watched over them to pluck up and to break down and to throw down and to destroy and to afflict, and Yah has, so I shall watch over them to build and to plant. Well, again, what does Yeshua say? I will build my assembly, and the gates or the gates of Sheol will not stand against her. Here, this is exactly what's being said here. How is he going to build his assembly? Out of the seed of Ephraim and Judah that have been sown into the nations. Guys, if you got a Bible, underline this one, highlight this one. This is a key component to understanding so much of what we've missed, what we have missed over 1,800 years in church life, in religious life. So very, very important verse, and we're going to go back to it at another time. So hold on to that. So big revelation, both houses are scattered into the nations. That's why Yeshua later on says the kingdom of God is like a man who sowed seed. Why is he sowing the seed? Why is he sowing the word? Because Judah and Ephraim are also sown into the nations and amongst men. Okay, so here we go. Verse 31. Now, of course, this should be familiar to everybody, but now with all that we've read, don't forget, we're talking about the concept of the idea that people think, well, Judah and Ephraim, they're gone. God's done with the house of Israel. No, he's not. That's not what we've been reading about. That is not the promise of God. Verse 31, see, the days are coming, declares Yehovah, when I shall make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. The people he just said were sown amongst men. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day when I strengthened their hand to bring them out of the land of Mitzrayim, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, declares Yehovah. For this is the covenant that I shall make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yehovah. I shall put my Torah in their inward parts and write it on their hearts, and I shall be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Of course, this is Shema that he's talking about. What he's actually saying is, finally, at some point in the future, finally, my people are going to get Shema. For real. For real, they're going to get Shema. It's not going to be everybody. It's going to be a remnant, but it's going to be a remnant of the house of Ephraim and a remnant of the house of Judah, and they're going to get it. And no longer shall they teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know Yehovah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. In other words, my sheep shall hear my voice. If you're really Yah's sheep, nobody's got to tell you. You'll hear. You'll get it. You'll respond. Yeah, obviously people tell you, but you get it. You understand. The Spirit moves you. You get it. Or just like he just said to Ephraim, you realize through instruction, and you were humiliated afterward, and you return. To the greatest of them, declares Yehovah, for I shall forgive their crookedness and remember their sin no more. Of course, this is the new covenant. This is Yeshua on the night before Passover, breaking the bread and drinking the wine, saying it's my body and my blood. This is what it does. So everything Jeremiah has been talking about the coming with that Ephraim's going to be the one to want to come back and sing and rejoice and be the watchman. And those whom I scattered, I'm going to bring back, and they're amongst men. All of that, that's the new covenant is the answer. That is the description of the new covenant. That's what the new covenant is actually about. Verse 35. Thus says Yehovah, who gives the sun for light by day, and the laws of the moon and the stars for a light by night. He's saying, all the stuff in the heavens and the sky, everything, who stirs up the sea and its waves roar. Yehovah of hosts is his name. If these laws, the sun, the moon, the stars, if these laws vanish from before me, declares Yehovah, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. Hold on a second. Remember, the history as it unfolded is for almost 2,000 years now. The thought has been God's done with them, finished with them. Now it's all about us, the Gentile church. That's not what Yah says the new covenant is about. The new covenant is a marker that no matter what happens, there will always be a house of Judah and a house of Israel or Ephraim, and or a tribe of Ephraim, tribes of Judah, and together, or nation of together, they will be the house of Israel. And so long as there's a sun, moon, star, if all of that stuff fades away and falls away, then you could say, I'll get rid of Israel forever. And obviously, guys, that stuff has not gone away. It is still here today. So to answer the question that Shaul already answered in Romans, is Yah done with his people? No, absolutely not. But then how do we reconcile his scattering and using them as an example like Egypt? And how does all of that then begin to make sense for us? And it does. And this is what Romans is talking about. So keep these verses that we just shared here in Jeremiah. We're going to come back to them, probably not by the end of this message, but by next week, because all of this stuff about Ephraim and how he comes back and all, it's all going to become very relevant by the end of chapter 11 in the book of Romans. But again, I doubt that we're going to get that far. Okay, so here we go. Has Yah, we just said, or I just asked this, has Yah rejected Judah and Ephraim? Chapter 11, verse 1. Certainly not. Certainly not according to Jeremiah, according to Isaiah, you just go through prophet to prophet to prophet to prophet. But Jeremiah, what we just read, explicitly tells us that the ministry of the New Testament is to guarantee that there will always be a house of Israel, no matter what happens, until he brings them all back. Certainly not, for I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Verse 2, Elohim has not rejected his people, whom he knew beforehand. Guys, that's a big statement. Or do you not know that the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with Elohim against Israel, saying, Yehovah, they have killed your prophets and overthrown your slaughter places, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the answer of Elohim say to him? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. He's using the story of Elijah as an example to tell us, yes, Israel's to be judged. Yes, the temple's going down. Yes, there's going to be a diaspora. Yes, there's going to be a horrible destruction of Jerusalem. But is that going to wipe out all of Israel? No. There is a remnant who does love him, who does serve him, who does understand the truth, who has been redeemed, who is part of the new covenant, who are the Netzarim, and they are from the house of Israel. That is what he is telling us here, using the example of Elijah. Of course, Elijah thinks he's all by himself, and of course, he's not. Verse 6, it says, and if by favor, verse 5, so therefore also at this present time, a remnant according to choice by grace has come to be. So he's saying, while most in the house of Israel may be destined to wrath in the first century where they were, and maybe even after, there is always a remnant of them. There always was, there is in his day, and there will be and is even in our day. And so he said, and how is this done? By grace. Just like the example of Pharaoh, by grace. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And everybody else that's already hard, their hearts are hard, I'm going to use it, and I'm going to make their hearts harder. Verse 6 says, and if by favor or if by grace, it's no longer of works. Otherwise, grace or favor is no longer favor. And if it's of works, it's no longer favor. Otherwise, works is no longer work. Let me put that in a more 21st sort of century type way, because it sounds a little weird the way he's saying it. What he's saying is grace and works are two separate things. And it's this has nothing to do with works. The picking of this remnant was by grace. They do works after, but it's by grace. If it's by works, then it's not grace anymore. And they're going to be with the rest of the house of Israel. This is by grace. Verse 7, what then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks. Remember, they were the ones of trying to obtain righteousness, but it didn't do it. Israel has not obtained what it seeks. But the chosen of who? Chosen of Israel. The chosen of Judah is who he's talking about. He's talking about the apostles, the disciples, and all those that would believe. But the chosen who are of Israel, so Israel will remain a nation no matter what, they did obtain it. And the rest, so there's the group chosen by grace, who hear Yah's voice, they are his sheep. It's a small number, they're the remnant. But the rest were hardened. And that should bring your mind right back to Pharaoh. Because he's telling us exactly the story. He got us in chapter 9. I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. He had compassion on the house of Israel. He hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Here he's saying, I'm going to have compassion on those of Judah that will believe. But not just them. He's talking about the Gentiles, the nations, and Ephraim. They're going to be chosen by grace. And the rest, I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them because their hearts are hard, and I'm going to harden their hearts even more. And history attests to that as it unfolds. Okay, so next verse then. This is Romans chapter 11 and verse 8. So the hardening of the house of Israel. He goes on to sort of speak about this a little bit. As it has been written, Yehovah has given them a spirit of deep sleep. I think the King James says stupor. Eyes not to see and ears not to hear. Remember, that's the thing we pray all the time. Well, actually, if we pray that, we're praying is, Lord, don't make me be like the people whose hearts are hard. I don't want to be that. I want to be the chosen. Unto this day. And of course, he's quoting Isaiah 29:10 and Deuteronomy chapter 29. I think it's verse 3 and 4. And I didn't want to take time tonight because I got so much to really share with you. But I encourage you, go back and pick up those scriptures, Isaiah 29, and you'll find out that it's in Isaiah 29 that Yeshua quotes from a couple of times. But one of the things he quotes out of Isaiah 29 is the whole idea of the blind leading the blind. So he's actually quoting Isaiah when he says those words. He's referring to what Isaiah had already established, because he is the word of God, and he's using it in the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you guys can do that on your own. Go ahead and check that stuff out. Verse 9 says, David also, so now he's going to give us another verse, David also, let their table become a snare, and for a trap, and for a stumbling block, and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened, not to see, and bow down their back always. And what he's actually quoting here is Psalm chapter 69 and verse 22. Again, we don't have time to, we'll never finish chapter 11 if we go through all that. But I, again, encourage you to read chapter 69 of Psalms because it's a phenomenal psalm. It's the story, yes, of what King David goes through, but Yeshua quotes it saying this is really, it was really about or speaks to his situation. And that's where it's in Psalm 69 where we get the verse when Yeshua says, they hated me without a cause. Well, he's quoting Psalm 69. And here it is. So he's speaking about the rejection, how they will reject him without a cause. They are the ones whose hearts will be hardened. John 15, verses 22 or 21 and 22. Actually, it's 21 through 25. I don't know what I did there. But here's what it says. But all this they shall do to you because of my name. This is Yeshua speaking. Because they do not know him who sent me. Their hearts were hard. Yeshua told them, you are not my sheep. You do not hear my voice, right? Verse 22, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would have had no sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father as well. If I did not do among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin. They would not be aware of their sin. But now they have both seen and have hated both me and my father. He's talking about the rejection from the leaders of Israel. And he's telling us this is what Psalm 69 is about, because he then quotes it. But that the word might be fulfilled, which was written in their Torah. See, that's kind of neat, because Yeshua is actually calling the Psalms Torah. Remember, Torah means instruction. So he's saying that the word might be fulfilled, which was written in their Torah, actually written in Psalms. They hated me without a cause, identifying all the words he just said as fitting into Psalm chapter 69. So go ahead and run with that. Go read it. It's some awesome stuff. But I want you to see. So Shaul is just talking more about the hardening of Israel, how this whole thing is going to play out, and how it was prophesied to play out this way. Here is chapter 11 and verse 11. Shaul now continues with the narrative, and he says, I say then, have they stumbled, meaning the house of Israel, northern and southern kingdom, that they should fall? In other words, fall forever? But we just read in Jeremiah, so long as there's a sun, moon, stars, that's not going to happen. Let it not be. And remember, so he just really answered the question, is God done with Israel? No. And that is the total opposite of what has been taught for the last almost 1,800 years, that God is done with Israel. He is done with the Jews. That is not gospel. That is not truth. That is not what the scripture says, and that is not what Shaul is saying here. But by their fall, they do fall, no doubt, by their fall, deliverance, salvation has come to the nations. Don't forget, who's scattered in the nations that we learned about in Jeremiah? Ephraim is. To provoke them to jealousy. The nations serving Yehovah are to provoke Judah, the people of his day, who have rejected Messiah. Think about that a second. It is the purpose of the nations in coming to faith to provoke to jealousy Judah, which means what is going to make Judah jealous? Well, nothing that we call modern religion today. Nothing that you turn on the TV and call Christianity today would in any way make any Jew, any person of Judah of any century jealous for what you were doing. What would make Judah jealous is if you and I were serving Yah the way the scripture tells us to. That would make Judah jealous. Those are my holidays. Those are my feast days. Well, we've all heard of before. What are you, Jewish? That makes Judah jealous. And that's what he's referring to here. And if their fall is riches, verse 12, and if their fall is riches for the world, like Pharaoh brought the riches to Israel, so the fall of Israel is going to bring the riches to the nations. And if their failure riches for the nations, how much more their completeness? Yah's not done with them. Restoration is coming. Verse 13, for I speak to you, the nations, inasmuch as I am an emissary to the nations. I esteem my service if somehow I might provoke to jealousy. In other words, again, show the Jews that Gentiles are serving Yehovah. But it's got to be in a way that the Jew is familiar with. It can't be something new that has nothing to do with Yah's word, nothing to do with what was already established. It can't be something new. It can't be new days, new feast days, new holidays. It can't be anything like that, because that they would not recognize that. But they would recognize Ephraim on Mount Ephraim calling out and saying, show me the way. I go back to Zion. I repented. I heard your instruction. I kicked myself in the butt and I was humiliated for all the silliness I was doing. And I have come back to you. My goodness, if that is not your testimony, that has to be our testimony. And that's what he's referring to here. That I might provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. Again, it's not going to be all of Judah. It's not going to be all of Ephraim, but it's going to be a remnant, some of them. For if their casting away, Jerusalem's fall, Judah's fall, destruction, the rejection of Messiah, is the restoration and grace or favor of the world, what is their acceptance? What happens when Judah really does see people of Ephraim, people of the nations, truly walking in Yehovah, and they recognize it, but there's something a little bit different about it. They don't know this Yeshua. They think you're something else. That thing, their acceptance, what will be their acceptance, but life from the dead. And I think he's referring to resurrection. I think he's referring to their understanding in connection with resurrection, but that we'll deal with another day. So neat stuff. Let's go on. Here's verse 16. So he's continuing on, and actually I think he is talking about resurrection, because look what the next verse is. Now, if the first fruit is set apart, is holy, the lump is also holy. What's he referring to? He's referring to the barley and the wheat harvest. Remember, if this, and again, this ties right into resurrection. The barley harvest on first fruits is the resurrections when Yeshua gets up, but it's not just Yeshua, it's all of those with him. And if they're holy and the barley harvest is acceptable, then the whole lump is acceptable. The whole lump is holy, or the whole wheat harvest would be holy. So so who's the first fruit? What obviously Yeshua is the first fruit, but he's telling us Israel is the first fruit. Remember, who gets raised with him? Israel does. Other people, saints from the past, get raised with Yeshua. They are the house of Israel. They are the down payment. They are the first fruits. But now, and since they're holy and they've made resurrection, because they've made resurrection, if once they understood it, now the blessing comes to all the nations and resurrection will come to us all. And if the root is set apart, holy. Now, I forgot to put it in yellow there. We're going to do a little analogy here in just a second, but when it says the root, it's referring to Yah's word, the Torah. If the Torah is holy, so are the branches. If the root is holy and the branch is connected to the root, then the branches are holy too. You're going to see it's going to become very, very familiar words to you coming right from Yeshua. But let me not jump ahead of myself. Verse 17 says, and if some of the branches, again, Netzarim, some of the Nazarenes, some of the branches, the Netzar, and if some of the branches were broken off, well, who was broken off? Judah was broken. Well, Ephraim was definitely broken off. But in context to who he's speaking about, Judah was broken off. Yeshua said, I'm going to take the kingdom from you. I'm going to give it to others. Judah was broken off. So, and if some of the branches were broken off, some, not all, don't forget, the disciples were all Jewish. If some of the branches were broken off, and you, speaking of the nations, the Gentiles, being a wild olive tree. Now, what's the difference between a wild olive tree and a branch that is connected to its roots? Well, that's the natural branch. A wild olive tree would be something that grew somewhere else and that is now going to be put into or connected to the root. Being a wild olive tree, the nations, let me read verse 17 again, just for text. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, the nations, have been grafted in among them, and came to share the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Now, hold on a second. Realize what he's actually saying. What root are we, the nations, as we come in, who we are, as we come into faith, as we walk down that way, what are we supposed to be sharing of? What are we supposed to be taking the fatness of? Of the root of the actual olive tree, which is the Torah, the covenants, all the words of God's instruction. That's the share of the root. That's what the root is. Verse 18, do not boast against the branches, against the Jews, against Judah, which is kind of weird because that's exactly what the Gentile church did. Exactly what we were told not to do. And if you boast, remember, you do not bear the root. You can't make a separate religion. You're not supposed to disconnect yourself from the root. And what is it we actually did? We disconnected ourselves from the root. We created something totally different. Again, until, like Jeremiah says, until I repented, until I was instructed, until I slapped myself in the thigh, and I was humiliated for what I did. That's what he's talking about here. You don't bear the root. You can't go start your own thing. But the root, which was already established, bears you. The Torah bears you. God's instruction bears you. You shall say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, good, he says. Because of unbelief, because of lack of faith, they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant in that, but instead fear. Remember, fear is the beginning of all wisdom, but fear. And here's verse 21, and we got to take this really seriously. For if Elohim did not spare the natural branches, he might not spare you either. And this, I mean, that should really be an eye-opener for all of us to tell us how serious this thing really, really is. I know so many sort of, we think about it as religion after a while. This is not. That we're talking about life and death here. And if Yah did that to what he called his people of his day because of their unbelief, do you think Yah will do any different both now and in the days to come? Okay, let's kind of zip through. I'm running out of some time here. Listen, there's a play on words that's going on here. Obviously, there's an analogy of branches, of olive tree, of root. And there's a couple of different analogies throughout the scripture. The house of Israel is called a fig tree. Sometimes it's called an olive tree. Sometimes it's called a vineyard. All of them have different aspects about them that tell us something a little bit different or convey a different point in the story that it's being used in. But the idea of an olive tree is definitely, these words that Shaul is talking about in Romans 11 come right out of John chapter 15, where Yeshua says, I am the true vine, the netzer, the branch. My Father is the gardener, and every branch in me that bears no fruit, he does what? He takes away. Now, I've heard people say, well, that he's really talking about on resurrection that day. If he finds out you're not in him, he's going to cast you out, and the branches are going to be burned. Guys, he's not talking about resurrection day for breaking off branches. He already broke off branches. We just read that in Romans 11. He broke off the branches that others could be grafted in. What he's telling us is, God breaking off branches is not something that's, judgment is judgment. He's talking about being judged here. He's talking about having no fruit here. He's talking about being fruitless here. He will break you off from the tree. He will have compassion on whom he has compassion, and he will harden whom he hardens. So we got to make sure that we are truly, truly walking in him. So he's setting up the analogy. I'm the netzer, because that's what the vine is. It's the true netzer. It's a sprout. And my Father's the vine dresser. This is in connection with Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1, the description of the son of Jesse who is coming, upon whom the whole spirit of Yah would be given to. Of course, we're talking about Yeshua. But look at what verse 1, chapter 11 says, and a rod, a shoot, a branch, a netzar. shall come forth from the stump of Jesse, and sprout from his roots and a sprout from his roots shall be fruitful. I want you to understand what the analogy that he's making, because again, we're not really kind of like agricultural people today, or at least not most of us. What you're looking there on the picture there, that's a netzar. That is a sprout. And what happens is with an olive tree, very often, the main trunk of the olive tree and all the roots to that olive tree go down, and somewhere off, sometimes in the trunk of the tree, sometimes at the base, sometimes somewhere along the root system, it could be 5 or 6 feet away from where the actual trunk is, but still connected to the roots, another green sprout will come up. Same plant, connected to the same roots, but it's different from the main trunk. And this is the analogy that he's trying to get across to us, or that Shaul is trying to get across to us. Here is a netzer that's grown up. And you can see there's the stump. That was the original branches. And the original branches were cut off. And a netzer, a true vine, came out. In this case, it's one that came out right in the center of the trunk. And it sprouted new branches. This is the analogy that Shaul is trying to get across to us. So I'm going to lay this out so everybody gets this. So the root that no matter where the netzer comes from, it's always connected to the same root that the original tree should have been connected to, but it had its branches cut off. The root is God's Torah, his word, his instruction, the seed. The olive tree, the branches, is the house of Israel, both northern and southern. And they had been growing for 1,500 years by the time Yeshua came. And Yeshua finds when he gets there that they have no fruit, no olive oil, and with no olive oil, no press, with a press, without the olives and the press, there is no oil, and without the oil, there is no light. The broken branches are many of the house of Israel that have been removed. Yeshua, in his parable, tells us he is the true vine, the sprout, the netzar, that thing growing off, not the same as the branches with no fruit, growing off, but still connected to the root. A netzar, different from the broken branches, but still Israel, connected to the root or the Torah. And of course, the nations, Ephraim, we're going to find out here, are outside. They're wild. They're not even connected to the netzar, but now they can be grafted into the house of Israel and nourished by the same root. And that's the key, guys. We were supposed to be nourished by the same root. We chose for 1,800 years to be nourished by something very, very different. That was a mistake. That was in error. Here's one more picture. This is kind of neat. I thought you guys would enjoy this. This is actually a grafting on an olive tree. And it's kind of neat the way that they do it. From what I read about this is, of course, they take a wild branch. You can see they make a slice in there, and they put the plant in, and they put this rope or cloth around it. They moisten it. They put sometimes some sort of a candle wax over it. And here's the thing. The branch that's on the outside, the branch that's being grafted in, it has to take in 3 days. If it doesn't take in 3 days, it's not going to take. Boy, isn't that's a message all by itself that I just don't have time to preach today. But think about that for a second. The grafting, and you know what the grafting is called? That when you come together with the true vine connected to the root, that branch, I wrote it up there, it's called a Zion. Now, it's spelled S-C-I-O-N, but so is Zion in some versions, called S-C-I-O-N, Zion. Zion is the place where the wild branch meets the true vine. Isn't that what we were told in Jeremiah? That they're going to go back, they're going to follow the way to Zion, to the grafting, to the bringing back in. What an absolutely wonderful message, worthy of a sermon all of its own. Okay, So neat stuff, crazy stuff. And here's that's the analogy that he's given to us. Matthew 21 and verse 18. Now, and returning to the city, along the same lines, some more stuff about fruit trees and fruit. And returning to the city, this is the coming into Jerusalem, right? Weeps over Jerusalem. And returning to the city early in the morning, he became hungry. And seeing a single fig tree by the way, he came to it and found nothing on it, naught on it, but leaves. And he said to it, let no fruit grow on you ever again. And immediately the fig tree withered. He's showing us in a very practical way what he's about to do to Judah, what he's about to do to the branches of that tree. Because here, this tree should have had fruit. If it has its leaves already, it should have already had fruit, and it had no fruit. And of course, Yeshua cursed it, telling us exactly what he said in John 15. If you do not have fruit, you will be cast aside. Luke chapter 13 and verse 6 is the parable of the fig tree. Same concept, but listen to this. As he spoke this parable, a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the gardener, look, for 3 years. Now, 3 years is enough time biblically for that tree to begin bearing fruit. It's circumcised already. The tree should be bearing fruit. So when it says 3 years, it's telling us this tree is mature. It should be bearing fruit. So look, for 3 years, I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree. So now it's a fig tree as opposed to, again, remember the olive tree. But listen, I want to get you mixed up. And find none. Cut it down. Why does it even make the ground useless? And he answering said to him, Master, leave it this year too. Guys, Yeshua's ministry was not 3.5 years or 3 years or anything like that. Yeshua's ministry was from Passover to Passover. 1 solid year. This is the acceptable year of the Lord. This is a parable of what Yeshua was doing. The fig tree, Israel in this case, as a fig tree, had enough time that it should have been circumcised and bearing fruit. 1,500 years of being attached to the root. And yet they did not. And yet in God's amazing compassion, he still gave them another year of watering, of fertilizing, of having the one who is the Torah to speak to them. He says, I fertilize it until I dig around it and throw in manure. And if indeed it bears fruit, good. And here it is. But if not, you're going to cut it down. And that's exactly what Yeshua did. And you're going to see this appear just over and over and over again in every single story. He's trying to tell us what's happening. Shaul's now trying to give it to us and understanding how this failure of theirs actually winds up to be a blessing in disguise, the way Yah always intended for it. But God is going to harden whom he hardens, and he's going to have compassion on whom he has compassion. All right, so last verse for today. I'm 2 minutes over, so here's verse 22. I wanted to leave you with the next verse as the last thought for today. So we've got, hopefully understand everything with the fruit and the case that he's making thus far for the necessity of Judah's branches to be broken, but he's still using Judah and will always have a Judah and always have an Ephraim in every age, so long as there's a sun, moon, and stars. Verse 22, see then the kindness and sharpness. I think in the King James, it actually says, see the goodness and the severity. I think the goodness and severity speaks more to our language, right? So see then the goodness and the severity of Elohim. In what? In that he's breaking off branches, the severity. The goodness is he's grafting in wild branches. So see the goodness and the severity of Elohim on those who fell. The house of Israel, the sharpness. But towards you who are of Judah, who are of Ephraim, we're going to find out next week, the nations, on you, kindness, which is exactly was the whole situation in Egypt. One destined to wrath, the other destined to compassion. and kindness. And here it is, I've got it in red. If you continue, if you abide in me and my word abides in you, you will bear fruit. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise, you also shall be cut off. That is a warning that has gone unheeded for a long, long time. But I think better things for you and I hope that tonight encouraged you. It was fun for me. I hope it was fun for you guys. Great stuff. We got some even more amazing stuff to talk about next week. It attached to this idea of Ephraim. But we'll get there next week. Let me encourage you guys to, if you're fed by this ministry, if you're encouraged by this, if you're learning something, consider supporting us. You can do it a whole bunch of different ways. All the information will be on underneath this video, at least in YouTube it will be. But if you have the app, you can support us through that. Thank you so much for your support. We really appreciate it. It helps us to do the things that we do. Don't forget to join us each morning for our morning manna. And of course, this week on our weekend message, certainly we have on Shabbat, we have our hidden manna. And then also on the weekend, we're going to start to talk about the Moedim. But the Moedim from a little bit different perspective, because we've talked about it so many times. We've been doing this for years, but a little bit different perspective this time. But the fall holidays are right around the corner for us. I know some are already celebrating it, but the fall holidays are right around the corner. So we're going to sort of get ready with it mentally and get some messages in, some prophetic messages. So with that, guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. I hope you enjoyed that. Guys, and as always, God bless and shalom.